Everyone. I stand between you and if you haven't had lunch yet. So, when Dr. Tambu asked me to talk about modeling, I decided to take this on with a little bit of trepidation because, one, I'm not especially an expert. We've been working with the government to try and help focus some of the requirements for hospitalizations and beds across the country. And so I'll share with you a little bit of that experience. But before that, I thought it might be good to just talk about infectious diseases and how they spread, and a little bit about what modeling really is and the various ways in which modeling is done. I'll sum up with a little bit on what we have done so far. So just when we think about infectious diseases, this is traditionally how we would portray it. We think about the virus, in this case, entering a person who is susceptible. And when we do that, on the y-axis is the abundance of the organism or the pathogen. Initially, you have it infecting a person at time 0. That's where the graph really starts. After a little while, it starts multiplying. And then it reaches a particular threshold after which it becomes infectious to other people. Soon the body starts kicking in with its innate and adaptive immune responses, and the viremia decreases. Even before it's completely gone, a person normally becomes non-infectious because there isn't enough of the virus which is active, which can continue to transmit disease. So this is what we see. So like I said, that first line there, and I'll try and use the mouse, if you can see. Okay, maybe this is better. So we have the time at which somebody is infected. The second thing is the time at which a person becomes infectious. And then we wait for the time at which recovery happens. That is the infection or the virological profile of this particular organism, the infectious profile. But when we think about it from a clinical perspective, again you have a time at which a person gets infected, then a time at which the person has his first symptom, and the difference between this we call the incubation period, following which the person continues to have symptoms for a while, becomes asymptomatic, and the disease subsides, right? And this again is related in several ways to the immunity, to the decrease in viral loads. Actual disease period is in this hatched red box, and this green line here shows the period for which a person is infectious. So what we are really trying to do when we do modeling or when we try to deconstruct how disease happens is we try to separate an infection into different buckets. So there is this first period of time here when the person is susceptible. He's not yet infected, he's not exposed to the virus. Then at this point, time 0, where there's infection written here, we have the person getting infected. After that, infection is essentially when the virus enters the first cell, really. Not really colonization, but it's really when it enters the cell. And disease is really a consequence of cell death or some immune responses related to the virus. So having thought about it, there is a period of time when the person has what we call latent infection which is occurred but not yet infectious. Then there is a period in which the person is infectious and possibly not yet showing symptoms, and that's what we call about the asymptomatic phase of an infection. So if you think about any viral infection, this is what you would expect to happen. You could have various variations of this. Let's go through that. There is the initial susceptible phase, after that infected but latent, then they are infectious but still asymptomatic, infectious and symptomatic. Finally, you have a time when they are non-infectious but still symptomatic, in ICU for instance. Then finally you have either the recovered or the removed situation. So we don't normally go through all of this when we do modeling. We try to simplify it, talking about susceptible, exposed, infectious, and recovered. Latent is the same as exposed. That is, a person is infected at some point but is really not infectious to others. Okay, Now think about the infection. So one thing that we are going to do is we are constantly going to think about how is this different from a non-communicable disease? How is this unique? And why is it that we see these bell-shaped or the exponential graphs that we see? So if you take the first person who was infected, and this is your primary case, he walks through this thing and becomes infectious at this point in time. This person gets infected at this is a primary case, this is your secondary case. So I'll just move on to show you that that is called what we call generation time. The time the first person is infected to the time the second person gets infected, and we call it generation time. What we also see in real life is the time between the first person becoming symptomatic and the second person in the epidemic becoming symptomatic, and we measure it by the difference between the two primary peak and the secondary peak, and we call that the serial interval. So what we can truly measure is the serial interval, because we can see the first symptom and calculate it. What we need for most modeling is generation time. But fortunately, the distributions of the generation time and that of serial intervals would be similar, and therefore you can approximate the generation time from the serial interval. Now there are a couple of other points. Patient doesn't have to become infectious at this point before he is symptomatic, which was the case with SARS-1. A person becomes infectious after he has symptoms, whereas in this SARS-CoV-2, you possibly have a person becoming infectious before he is symptomatic, and that's why you have asymptomatic infection. We'll come back to the ramifications of that a little later, but I'm doing this just so that we know what we use is called a generation time. You will hear that quite often. If anybody has a question, you can stop me now, or we can discuss this later. So, thinking about infectious diseases, the one thing that happens is you need a person or a infection to enter a susceptible population first time. But having done that, once you've infected someone, the people who got infected and have become infectious are then the agents who progress this transmission. So this is just an animation to show you what happens. Let's say this person comes into contact with 4 people, but on an average can infect 2. And then these 2 people then progress to have their 4 contacts, of whom on an average they will infect 2. It's not that everyone will infect 2 people exactly. Some will infect 1, some will infect 5, some will be a super spreader. But on an average, each infected person will infect 2 others. And this is what you see. So essentially, this is how the dynamics work. So 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, and then quietly it spreads very fast till you have not many susceptible people left in the population. So this brings us to an important concept that we use, which is called the R0 or the R0. R0 is essentially the number of secondary infections from a primary case during the course of his infectiousness that happens in a totally susceptible population. So imagine you are in an island where everybody is susceptible, or at the beginning of this pandemic, where we believe all of us were susceptible to coronavirus. The first case that comes in, how many people can it infect during the course of the infectiousness of the first individual? That really gives you an idea of R0. But that's not very easy to calculate because we don't know who that first person is. Anyway, we'll move on. So what does that depend on? Now, let's forget about formulae for the moment. It's lunchtime and we are not supposed to be thinking about formulae. But think about what would determine if this audience sitting here, if I am the person who's bringing the infection in, what would matter? I think it's how long I stand here and speak, how far I am from you, and the number of people I'm coming into contact with, being an infectious person. Those are factors that would matter. In addition, it would matter whether this bug really is catchy. As in, if I share it to you, will you pick up the infection? So there is an inherent catchiness which we call the probability of infection given contact. And then the other thing that matters is how many contacts or effective contacts do we have over time, right? So those are the 2 dimensions. What you can change, and what we are trying to through these non-pharmacological interventions, is to change the contact patterns that we do. Either it's lockdown, distancing, and so on. We are trying to prevent contact between infectious and infect. So when I say contact, I'm not talking about shaking hands alone. I'm essentially saying the ability to transmit the bug from the infectious person to the susceptible host. what we are not really able to change at this point is the character of the bug itself, the catchiness of the bug. And that is a function of the bug and also of the whole infection process that we talked about. Whether it is infectious during the asymptomatic phase, how much of viral shedding would happen with this bug, would the virus be maximally replicating in the oropharynx or would it be deep down inside the alveoli, for instance, and all of that has its own characteristics. So the catchiness depends on where it is. If a bug is in the nose or in the oropharynx, higher probability of it transmitting as compared to something which is deep down in the peritoneum, which if you don't open up the peritoneum, you do not transmit the bug, right? So to just leave you with what really matters here is the contact patterns and the probability of transmission. So here is the first picture. Again, I'm just reiterating what we said. This first gentleman who is infected comes to this community. He exposes 3 people who then get infected. So what does this mean? This means that as you have more number of infectious people in the population, each subject in this population has a higher risk of getting infected. For instance, if I go back to this point, only these 3, there is essentially one person infecting maximum of 3 people. Now you have 3 plus possibly the 4th person also able to transmit disease, right? So this population has a higher risk of picking up the infection as there are more people who are infectious. Finally, you reach a point in time where a large proportion of your population is infectious. So the velocity of infection is really high as the epidemic progresses. But thankfully for us, once you get an infection, you start becoming immune. And a lot of people who picked up the infection will then no longer be infectious and no longer able to transmit the infection to others. And that leads us to people who are generally protected. Now supposing one of these people who have not been infected first acquires the infection, he goes probably to some other country, picks it up and comes back here, and all of us are immune, or at least most of us are immune. The chance that this person can then spread it to that one susceptible person sitting somewhere in that corner is remote because he is protected by all the others who are actually immune and cannot transmit disease. So this is the understanding behind herd protection. So when you have a lot of people who are immune, they will provide you some kind of a protection against getting infected. Of course, if this person is sitting right next to this individual and is a primary contact, that person will get infected. So we are not going there for the moment. So I just want to summarize what I have said in the last 12 minutes. It's probably that infectious diseases are dependent happenings. That means it depends on the prevalence of infectious people in a population. Second thing is that the risk of a susceptible person developing infection depends upon the prevalence of infection in the population. The more the number of infectious people, the more the probability that I will get infected. So today, our probability of picking up an infection is very small. But during the peak of the epidemic, the probability of a susceptible person picking up infection is large. Post-epidemic, when most of us are then immune, our probability is low because herd effect kicks in. Right? It also depends on the contact patterns between susceptible and infectious people. Right. So when we talk about modeling, people think about very sophisticated mathematical equations. But actually, in reality, we all model all the time. Right? Modeling is just a rational way of putting things together. So we create models, but we don't explicitly state what our assumptions are. And a model does just that. It tells not only that we are thinking logically, it tells you what your assumptions are. I assume that the generation time is 4.6 days. I assume that the incubation period is 5.5 days. So when I state those assumptions, then it becomes easier for us to set up the model. So modeling is just that. You create a logical framework by which infection progresses in an individual, infection progresses in a population, and you state all the assumptions. If you get all your assumptions right, you know the truth. But unfortunately, there is never a situation when models are perfect. So all models by necessity are imperfect, but some of them are right, and this is not my statement, this is George E.P. Box. You'll hear this number of times, and this is not just for infectious disease models, this is for statistical modeling as well. All mathematics has the same problem. Models are generalizations, and when we start off an epidemic, we don't have answers to most of our assumptions. It's as good as what goes on in our mind. Then as we get data, we get parameters that we can push into these models and make them better. So maybe on the 24th of April, you will say that the epidemic will die down by the 16th of May, based on whatever your assumptions were. But slowly you will say, oh no, that's not what's happening. We don't think this is going to happen. You're going to have an outbreak that happens. So when you talk about models, there are three different broad kinds of models. The first one is what we call the compartmental models. That is, take the entire population of the world and put them into compartments or buckets. Everybody starts off in a susceptible bucket. Some of us will move into an infected or infectious bucket. And finally, the rest of us will move into a recovered or a removed bucket. So those are three buckets, and you can have many, many more buckets built into it, and I'll just talk about that. That's one way of modeling. So that is at a population level. You take the entire population, put them in buckets, and then say the progression from one bucket to the other is determined by a certain set of parameters, certain set of assumptions that we have. We state our assumptions, we put them onto a model and say, if these assumptions are right, this is how you would progress. This is what the force of infection would be. There are a second set of models which don't put everybody into a bucket. They take prototype individuals. Let's say they take 1,000 people, we have them well characterized. We say here is the probability of this individual as a prototype of someone who leaves at 7:30 in the morning in his car, goes to CMC, works there, meets 30 people, comes back in the evening, of which 5 of them might be patients with COVID. The second prototype would be a person who will sleep at home, who's a medical student, and who will only attend classes over Skype. So you will have several such people, and you put all of them together in a pile, and then you will run simulations. You will run them several thousand, several million times, and then you start getting the distribution of how the epidemic would progress given your assumptions, but at the level of each individual. So those are simulations which are individual level models that we use. The third kind of modeling is the one which happens later in an epidemic, when you start looking at the trajectory of what's happening. So you see the growth rates that are there, you look at what's happened so far in terms of testing, look at those trajectories and say, based on these trajectories, I think this is what's going to happen in the future. But unfortunately, that does not take into consideration the changes that are expected to happen, and it doesn't have a biological background behind it. It just looks at data. It works pretty well. In fact, it works very well in the financial markets. You can use the candles and you can essentially look at them and say, when is it going to fall? And people have made a lot of money on it. Unfortunately, biology just doesn't work that well. So I'm not going to go into those trajectory-based models. They are useful, but right now we're going to be talking about primarily the compartmental model, which is the simplest, and a little bit about agent-based models. Finally, these models can be either deterministic or stochastic. They're just simple words to say that stochastic models are the ones where you put a little bit of random chance also into it. So you say that there is a 70% probability of you getting infected, that would be deterministic. And then you take that and use that 70%, but let random chance generate what would actually happen to each individual. So both help. Deterministic model will have just one line. The stochastic models will have an uncertainty limits around those curves that you will see shortly. Okay, moving on, and I think I'm running out of time, so here we are. So the simplest model that we use is called the susceptible, infectious, infected, recovered models. Okay, that's called an SIR model. So like I said, we all start in the susceptible pool. Some of us move to the infected pool, and some of us then will move to the recovered pool. Hopefully that will be all of us. And these infected individuals here are the ones who are going to create this pandemic or this excess infections in the susceptibles, right? A little more complex model, which is what we really use for our modeling, is also brings these asymptomatic infections into the model. So you have the susceptibles and the people who have been exposed but not necessarily seen as diseased, and then the recovered model. So if you think back to what I talked about initially about an individual and what happens to viremia, this is at the population level. Only thing to remember here is we have to be in one of these buckets at every point in time. You're either here, here, or here. The sum total of this is the total population, right? Okay. Now, what does it depend on? How do people move from susceptible to infected? And we talked about that being the force of infection. We said that has something to do with how catchy the infection is and how much of contacts people have with each other. right? What determines recovery? It's a characteristic of the bug, it's a characteristic of our immune system, it's a constant, and it also has something to do with the therapy or treatment that we can provide, right? So this, again, if you start off, everyone is susceptible, and this is a susceptible curve that goes down, and this small graph here is the number of people who are getting infected on each day. And this particular graph includes those who are getting infected, those who are asymptomatic but are generally getting immune. So what you notice here is everybody starts here, but not everybody by the end of the epidemic is infected, right? There are still a large proportion of people susceptible when the epidemic dies down. And this is partly because of herd effect, and we will look at that shortly. Again, going back, the SIR model, you have people who are susceptible, infected, and recovered. So when we do these models, what are we doing? We are making an average for everyone. Average behavior for the susceptible pool, an average behavior for the infectious pool, and an average behavior for the recovered pool, because we are working at the population level. Sometimes that's not fair. People in Mumbai, probably living in crowded slums, are different from people in Vellore. Right? The older people have a higher probability of getting severe disease. Is it fair to take an average for these people, even if you take a weighted average? Is that okay? So then comes the question of, can we make that better? So you can do this. You can classify them into different risk groups within each pool, and you can do stratified different strata you can create models, so they get complex as you go. And when you finally separate each individual out based on his characteristic and run a model or a simulation, that's what the agent-based model really reflects. Okay, so those are the general ways in which we do modeling. Finally, you also have to think about the clinical consequences. So what the model first tells you is how many people are moving from susceptible to infectious, infectious to recovered. But we are more concerned about once you're infected, what happens to people. Some of them are asymptomatic. A lot of them may develop mild disease as ILI or an upper respiratory infection. You have some who will be hospitalized with severe acute respiratory infections, or maybe you have other manifestations that happen. Some will go to ICU. Even among all of these, a lot of them will recover, and asymptomatics probably will recover entirely, but for the others, a fraction of them will recover at different stage. A few will progress to death. So, and how much is that? And we would have heard Dr. Osi talk about this before, but what seems to determine this, one strong factor is age. People above 60 seem to be at a much higher risk. People above 80 seem to be at a horrendous risk. This is not risk of developing the infection. Developing infection or acquiring the infection seems to be reasonably uniform. But once you incur an infection, it appears that people who are older seem to behave badly. Same thing goes with people like me who are obese. Gender is an issue. That is, males seem to have a higher risk right from a younger age group up to the older age group. And we also know that healthcare access would make a difference. So if you treat people early, you are able to provide them oxygen therapy, you may be able to pick up things that you can change. This again is a graph from Verity et al. There's a group from Imperial which did this modeling. Very interesting data which it has kind of held all through now with larger population data sets becoming available. We see that the risk of mortality is really up here in the older age group. Fortunately for a country like India, that's about 10% of the population in all. Okay, so this is coming back to the trajectory modeling that I talked about, which is you take what you see and then you project into the future. The London School of Hygiene last week released this data, which is for India, and this graph shows, these gray bars show you the number of cases each day, and the graph on top of it is your projected growth rate and the uncertainty around that growth rate for the country. So they're saying that it's still going to progress upwards. That's the important point here, the projections. But these projections can't go too far into the future because they don't have a biological basis. The second graph is your R naughts. So R naught, as I told you, is the number of people who can get infected from a primary person. That value at the beginning of the epidemic was believed to be something between 2.2 and 2.4. But now when we back calculate from all the testing results, it looks like it is closer to 2 than to 2.4. But what you also see is this downward trend. The R naught over time has fallen. It's now looking, but it's still above that magical number of 1. Why is 1 an important number? Remember, R naught is the average number of people that will get infected from an infectious person. So if one infectious person will infect only another infectious person, there is no growth for the epidemic. It remains stable. If on an average, one infectious individual infects 1.1 person, it will be a slowly growing epidemic. It will keep growing till that effective R falls below 1. So when the R falls below 1, you know that the epidemic is going to die out. So if you have, for instance, in the UK, they believe the R right now is about 0.8, which means given all the measures that they have put into in terms of physical distancing, in terms of testing, whatever they have done, I mean, they're not doing much of testing, but they seem to have brought it down. Whereas our data suggests that you're still above 1, you brought it down from 2.1 or so, but it's not really come down to below 1 yet. And now we release the lockdown. So you expect, once your contact patterns change, you will expect the R to start moving up again. This is a graph which shows you which are the states that are doing poorly, that is, which are the states where the growth is still happening versus the states in which you've definitely seen a significant decline. And the ones in gray are the ones where you have less than 40 cases happening at any point in time, so they don't have confidence to say, is it growing or is it coming down? Punjab has certainly started coming down. They believe Kerala is coming down, but for a large part of our country, it's definitely increasing, and this is data as of 8th of May, but now it looks like Tamil Nadu is also on the increasing side. So this will keep changing, and you can actually view this. It's available online. I put the link up here. I'll share the slides as well. Right, so going back to how we do the modeling, very quickly, 2 minutes. We identify the appropriate model, and the appropriate model is based on biology. Then we look at how we get those parameters that I talked about. What is the R0 that we are using? How do you think the contact patterns are in the population? What is the age structure of the population? What is the risk profile of the population? And so on. And finally, we fit a model and we say, here is what we think it will. But the proof of the pudding is really in going back and trying to identify, are these parameters right? Right, so you go fit your model against the data that's available, and here is where we hit a bottleneck. If everybody tests standardly, uniformly across time, then you can easily fit the model back and change your parameters around to say where am I getting the best fit to my curve. But unfortunately, like all countries, we had to scale up testing. We had different policies at different point in time, and we are not universally testing, or we are not testing even consistently over time or across space. So this is a challenging effort, but as data becomes more and more available, this is going to get better. And we believe that death data is what's being used in Western countries. We know most of our deaths don't happen in a hospital, and we can't use that data. So the best data we think we have will be the SARI data, and when that gets reported consistently, you'll be able to fit these models against that. Right, so where are we right now? So this was the original model that we started with. The graph is, I mean, when you start looking at those numbers, you see that they are in millions per day. This is on the peak of the epidemic. We would have expected about 32 million events to happen on that day, infections to happen. Sounds terrible. So what has the lockdown done for us? If you believe that the lockdown for a 21-day period was 75% effective in reducing R0, it would push that peak of the epidemic down a little bit. It will not change the height of the epidemic, it will push it further into time. That's all it does. It moves the epidemic, because the moment you release that lockdown, again up goes the parameters. But if you can continue and to reduce the R0, if not to 75%, but by even 25% reduction from what it was. That is, we were in crowded buses, no masks, traveling all over the place. We changed that a little bit. We wear masks, we keep a little bit of distance. You can slow that down. And as long as you keep slowing it down, the peak moves further away, and actually you can decrease the peak a little bit. But ultimately, what really makes a difference in an epidemic is the proportion of people who have got infected and therefore are immune, or because you have vaccinated them and they become immune. That is what's going to stop the infection spread. The rate at which it happens can be flattened, and it's extremely useful. One, because it gives us time to mentally and infrastructure-wise prepare ourselves, but we'll still have the same number of cases to see. So I'm just going to go again to the one projection that comes from our original model. It tells us that around August 20th to September is where you would expect the largest peak. And this is different from what we started off with. We expected it to be in June. But given that what we have observed about the decrease in R0 so far, and the duration of the lockdown. So we thought it's not been uniform, and if you look at the Google mobility data, you'll realize that when we started the lockdown, we had about 50% reduction in R0. But slowly that changed to now it's about 22 to 23% is the effectiveness of the reduction in R0 even with the lockdown till yesterday. Now that this has changed, hopefully it will still be lower, but it's not going to be hugely lower. Unfortunately, that's the case. So this is what we expect to see. If you look more carefully at this graph, this shows you the number of severe cases that you would expect in a population. What about Maharashtra? Now, Maharashtra had an earlier epidemic. Its R0 was higher. So its peak is not in August. It's in July. So you see that the peak is earlier. Sorry. So Tamil Nadu is between August, so I go back to that. In fact, the previous slide here, this should show you that. The model says that it will be about August 20th to September 15th. So we'd expect in Tamil Nadu severe, that is hospitalized or patients who require some kind of oxygen support, about 45,000 cases admitted every day. 45,000. Yes. So we'll go down to the actual numbers. If you look at India, it's about 1,320 million people, of which we expect, if nothing changes, 800 million will be infected. 500 million of them will have some kind of symptoms, and 4.4 million would die. But this assumes that nothing is going to change, the temperature is not going to have an effect, God is not going to do any work, and we are not going to find any kind of treatment that's going to work. So these are the worst case scenario, but these are useful in terms of planning. But think about this as a country. These are 132 squares. Okay? We have about 11% of our population, 10.3% of our population, which is about 60 years of age. Now in that, you expect 60% of them to get infected, right? The proportion that would die is considerably large. It's about 2.2 million in that age group. How about the rest of us? Less than 60. That's all the other squares that are sitting out here. Again, 60% of us would get infected. Again, about 2 million people would die across the country. Now, 2 million still sounds horrendous for people under 60, right? So, but it may not be this bad, because if you say that the outbreak will stop not at 60%, but at 45 or 50%, the first wave will go. There are several things you can hope for. I'm not complicating that at this point. Let's look at Tamil Nadu again. 77 million people at this point, of which we expect about 30 million infections in the younger people, as in less than 60, 4.7 million infections in people who are above 60. Of these 30 million who get infected and have some symptoms, only 1.2 million young people will get admitted across the state. There will be 58,000 deaths in Tamil Nadu. Of the about 1 million that get hospitalized in the older people, you would expect about 250,000 to 260,000 deaths. Now, clearly tells you there is a high-risk population and you need to find some way of slowing down events in that group. It also tells you that a lot of us have a risk, but it's much, much smaller than for everybody else. In fact, if you compare it against SARS-1 or you compare it against MERS, this is really nothing in terms of infection fatality ratio. So that's the silver lining. So lots of us are going to get infected if the epidemic plays out the way it will. Now this is Vellore district. So if you were looking for numbers, 40 lakh people across the entire Vellore district, 16 lakh people who are symptomatic over the course of the epidemic. This is not wave 1 alone, it's over the course of the epidemic. 2.5 lakhs in the older age group. Finally, we're talking about 3,000 younger people, less than 60 dying over the period of the epidemic, which may be a year or more, and 14,500 people above 60. Now these are just numbers. Are these models right? They are based on the assumptions, but they are also based on biology. This model assumes that people mix with each other randomly. It's not true. Large proportion of Vellore's population is not inside Vellore city. It's not in the slums of Kaspa or of Saidapet. They are in villages. So you may not see this kind of a spread very fast, and we haven't actually been able to model that yet. The validation of these models, like I said, depends upon what data we see, by which time we just can say we were right or fortunately we were wrong. But either way, I'll leave you with that and for questions. But since I've run out of so much of time, sorry, I didn't realize it's going to take this long. No, I'm done. Yes. Can we get Dr. JP back on?
Hand. So we'll take questions from Prasad, but we'll just see if Dr. JP, our moderator, has any comments. Sir, would you like to give some comments, sir? Sir, we can't hear you. Yes, sir.
Okay. I think I'm waiting for the question.
Prasad, he can't hear unless you're on the mic.
Can you hear me?
So Jabu, just a question. 3 countries seem to have stopped the epidemic in its tracks: China, Korea, and Taiwan, with a very small number infected relative to their population, and they're holding on. I mean, the other countries, like say Germany, population is 83 million, in Tamil Nadu is 71 million. They peaked and they're going down. So they've peaked at 177,000 cases. And it's not they've been testing less, they've got 1 positive for about every 20 tests they've done. So how come they're not reaching the kind of numbers we're discussing here? Is it because they're doing better at a society or what?
So, one, I won't comment about China. I really don't know what's happening in there. But yes, their peak came down, and so will our peak come down. I mean, there's no question about it. But the problem is, if you don't have, so your question is, how did they manage it without everybody getting infected, for instance? Is that the question? So, they right now have I told you there are 2 parameters that matter. One is the infectiousness of an organism, and the other one is your holding pattern for contacts. If you put in mechanisms by which you can keep distance for a fair bit, you will manage to prevent infections as long as you continue to do that. For instance, Germany, for instance, has a good testing policy, but they also have, it's not perfect. If you look at Taiwan, that's what they managed to do. Taiwan's a small country again. The question is, have they peaked already or not? So this is something that's very interesting to look at. Even if you look at India, people have said the same thing. We have peaked at whatever number, but we haven't till the epidemic really dies down. And the epidemic will die down when you know that the R naught has moved on. Dr. JP, do you want to take that question as well?
No, I just want to say, am I audible, Jabu? Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
It is difficult to compare these things because in many areas where we thought things were calm, there is recurrence. The thing is, the basic rule is same. If there are adequate number of susceptible, the virus will creep back. That is the important rule. Jabu didn't tell you also one little thing. You can artificially reach an R effective of 1 artificially by severe lockdown. But if the 1 is a magical number because from a point of view of laws of thermodynamics, that is the stability point. The infection, immune, and susceptible seek. It's very difficult when they reach there. For example, measles can remain in that R is equal to 1 for years. German measles can remain an R is equal to 1 for 7 years. So it's a tricky one and difficult to comprehend. So it is not safe when you are far away from, you are locking down artificially to hope that it will go away once adequate number have been infected in a community. So even though you ask this question, how come there, how come there? I don't think we know the full story yet.
Okay, just one more question. Just one more question, Yabu. See, the thing is, a lot of your modeling, I presume, depends on what proportion of the infected population is asymptomatic. And because if a large proportion is asymptomatic, then you'll have more infected that you don't know about. And there's not a lot of antibody studies going on. The German study showed 15% antibody positive in a population. Diamond Princess, where everybody was tested, only 17% were asymptomatic, but that was predominantly an older population. So do we have enough good antibody studies, large ones, I hear that CDC is trying to do in 25 cities, to show what is the asymptomatic infection rate? In the German study in Gangel, 15% of 1,000 were antibody positive and 2% were RT-PCR at the same time.
Right. So the model doesn't really depend on what proportion is asymptomatic, but having said that, if you have had a large proportion who are asymptomatically infected, we wouldn't have seen them in real life. So you may have a larger proportion who have already been infected and therefore immune, and that's the question. So the question about antibody assays, it was the early antibody assays that came probably had cross-reactivity with other coronaviruses. So now there are assays that are available. Roche has come up with a recent one which seems to be doing really well. THSTI has a new assay which is an IgG assay which again is doing very well. They are now doing that in Mumbai in 10,000 people. There is also a proposal from the National Biopharma Mission to do it in 4 places including Vellore, where they are going to do the seroepidemiology studies. So those assays seem to be having about 99.5% specificity, and which is not perfect in a low prevalence or incidence area, but still it's a great test as compared to the 70% sensitivity and 85% specificity. So when you talk about the problem was early in the disease, when the prevalence is extremely low, if you don't have a really good test, it's really not worth going after those assays. Now that we expect the prevalence to be about 10% in places which have seen a wave that has gone through, these assays become critical. And you're right, until we do those seroepidemiological studies, we won't know what proportion of asymptomatics have been infected and are immune. And if that is large, then you probably think that maybe it is not 60-40 that we should be working with. It should be probably 30 symptomatic and 70 asymptomatic. But right now the jury is out. There is no data to convince us that that's the case. We're still working with the best case scenario, best evidence available so far of 35% being asymptomatic. Dr. JP?
Hi.
Jacob.
Yes. Yeah, Royal.
Any historical data from the Spanish flu? What happened in states like Tamil Nadu back then?
The Spanish flu in Tamil Nadu, I don't really know the data from Spanish flu for Tamil Nadu, but there were some studies which, so the thing is at that time we didn't have much data from Tamil Nadu as such. Somebody did something in the cemeteries, right? So they went to and looked at the number of deaths that happened over a period of time. But I don't know if there are any studies specifically from Tamil Nadu in the Spanish flu. Dr. JP, do you know any?
There is a book called Pale Rider. Pale Rider on Spanish flu epidemic. That has a lot of information and these kind of stuff come there. Remember, we were a cantonment area. So there was some documentation, but a whole lot of things because the war was suppressed. But this book gives a lot of information. Pale Rider.
So thank you, Dr. Jayseelan. We'll just hang around. We'll have questions in the end as well.
Could you get the full screen? You got full screen. Okay. Good afternoon. Thanks, Tambu, for this opportunity. I'm very happy to be here. After Jebu's excellent presentation, that I am going to use these models for our work. So I was called by Principal Secretary from Secretariat one day from Chennai, and he asked me to help them in their projections. Then he said he'll send some data. This is 0.3 per million is the prevalence of infections. So these are the slides from what he sent. And this tells us that he says as of 25th May that we should have 30 lakhs cases of infections in India, and this is the hospitalization should be 125,000 cases, and so on and so forth. Now this is the number of deaths, that is nearly 13,500, but the deaths in India so far is only around 4,000. Now, so this is about the older population, which is very alarming, that this is what they have said, so let us not go into the detail. This is another institution from Delhi which is advising the government, has given me the data. That is in Tamil Nadu, they have done the projection for Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu has 8.3 crore population, and this is the data. In 2 months' time, that this is what the cases should be, 1.2 crore, 15% infections, and this is the optimistic estimate that they have given to the Secretariat. So then he asked me that, do you think that this is what we are going to have in the near future? Then I need to say yes or no. I said, no, this is too much. This is unbelievable number. I went by that China prevalence data. So this is the common sense, what should have been the number. But I need to substantiate that my argument with the modeling. That is what they expect from us. Fortunately, I had very young people, 4 people to help me about in modeling. Jebu said that he has used modeling, the same modeling which we have also used. Fortunately, we were able to go through the codes. We did not use any package which are available in the system, in the internet. So we were able to understand what is happening as we change the scenarios. So that is what I am going to present to you. Then they have organized a meeting with the Delhi people to see why their estimates are very optimistic and not realistic. So I had to tell them that by the time that my work was shared with them, so it was a meeting, telephonic meeting with them. And they asked me with this 3 weeks of data from Tamil Nadu, so how can you do the modeling? So the modeling is a bit challenging work. Whatever little data you have, you should be able to project it for reasonably at least 10 days or 15 days. That is what Jabu said, trajectory modeling. And you also have the deterministic modeling like SIR modeling. So we should not be waiting for the sea to dry to count the fishes. So you should keep fishing to see what is the number that we are going to get. That is the work which we started. That is what I am going to present to you. So therefore, to project the number of cases in Tamil Nadu and India for a couple of weeks from May 8th, we stopped working May 8th and we sent out 2 papers. To estimate the maximum number of cases, that is, and the time at which that would occur. That is what the SIR model which provides. And to estimate the baseline reproduction number or 0 and the dynamic R over a period of time. It keeps changing. And just to study whether the impact has brought down the new cases through the modeling. So the projection, so we have used the trajectory models, logistic growth model, and susceptible infection and recovery, SAR models, so 2 models. That one takes the rate of change and predict what other case is going to be in 2 weeks' time. And the other one is going to give you what is the maximum number of active cases and the time at which the maximum will occur. Those are 2 different concepts to see. And so there are 2 kinds of model which are very commonly used for trajectory model. One is the exponential model and another one is logistic growth curve models. The exponential model gives you that it is keep going, so therefore it is likely to overestimate the numbers. So we looked at the China curve, and this is basically any epidemic, it has to, after some time, it has to get stabilized. Therefore, ideally speaking, it should follow logistic growth curve model. So therefore, the exponential curve model, as he said correctly in biology, that we did not want to use, it's going on increasing, and therefore we used logistic growth curve model. This is the model which he has got. He has used. This has got the ceiling effect. So it tells you the maximum, this would be the number, then you estimate your number and see how these observed and projected numbers are getting closer to each other. So this is what we have done. And we were okay up to this point in time, and this is then we projected it for another 2 weeks. And so we were happy about the way the numbers were going up. Now, this is, suddenly you see the Chennai, Wuhan, the Coimbatore market accelerated the growth. That until then, May 3rd, this was the rate of increase. Suddenly it increased to 5.5 times more. So there is a severe acceleration. Our model has derived. As he said, it picks up the growth rate and builds for another 2 weeks or whatever. So therefore, as I said, that the modeling has to be repeated very frequently, see whether it can capture the changes. So therefore, this is the model for Tamil Nadu, that as you see here, up to this point, this is what I presented in my earlier slide. Suddenly, the Coimbatore data came back and it started increasing. Therefore, we need to repeat it, redo the modeling work to capture the change. So now the trend is totally different. So what we are saying here is that, say, end of May, that we should be able to get around 20,000 cases or whatever. No, 120,000 cases as a worst case scenario to be reported in Tamil Nadu. So see, this tells you how closely the projection is coming along with your observed data. Therefore, you are confident this is what's going to happen. Now, this is just about the trajectory model. This is what we have done for all India as well. This is the same thing has happened for all India. That you see, this is the model up to May 3rd, and after that started increasing. Then therefore we were able to revise this number. So this is what we are saying is that this is for India. We are saying 1,20,000 cases should be reported soon. So now this is based on the this is up to end of May. This is what should be the number that India is expecting to have. Now, this is about the SAR model, which Jebu has explained to us, to estimate the maximum number of cases and the time at which that would occur. So this is the goal of this model. But fortunately, that this model works mainly with the number of susceptibles and the reproduction rate at the origin. So unless you change the reproduction rate at origin, it doesn't change. Your population is same, only you could change only the R0. So therefore, this is what we had done was, we went back to the countries where the epidemic was over, and we did the modeling for those countries. So by the time that Italy, North Korea, and China, the epidemic was over, so therefore we had the data. So what we did was, we did the SAR modeling for these countries, and we studied this part. This is what Jebu said, this is number of active cases excluding the recovery. So anytime there are active cases, so if you add the recovery number, then you will get the number of infections in your state or the country. So what we did was that we went through this paper and we redid the modeling for China, that Wuhan districts. So we studied very carefully the number, there are 25 provinces had a higher incidence, where 5 or 6 provinces, absolutely no incidence, we excluded them. See here, this is the actual data for Wuhan province, the district or whatever, and the model gave us this number. So this is the peak time. So clearly it tells us the modeling is not working very well for the data, China data. Therefore, in epidemiology, we say that when we establish surveillance centers, and so we wanted to know, there is a curiosity whether the surveillance centers are giving us the right data or not. Therefore, the epidemiologists do a special study survey to see what is the kind of relationship you have with the epidemiology surveillance center and the epidemiologic studies. Then you could adjust for that kind of thing in future for the data which is derived from the surveillance center. The same principle, this we did in 1998 with the Korean and myself, we got involved in the STD study, and the STD surveillance centers, we started producing the number, then we were able to match up with our survey, the study data, prevalence study data, to the number which were produced by surveillance center. As you see here, this is the difference in your actual number and the model predicted number. So similarly, we did this for South Korea, and North Korea, and South Korea, and Italy, and other countries. And now, this is the data. So we understood that there is some kind of overestimation going on. If I apply this model, I should be able to estimate what kind of over-prediction should happen in my state or in my country. So that has to be gauged based on the total number of population of the state or your country. So now this is, if you look at this one, that this data, this tells you, we used South Korea because that Tamil Nadu state has 8 crore population, South Korea also had an 8 crore population, and we assumed, as he said, everybody worked with the 2 to 2.5, the reproduction number. But please remember, this model is very sensitive to what is the number which you deal. But that is the premise which model works, because number of susceptibles. It tells us that this is this point in time, that the number of active cases should be 15,000 active cases. So now we need to look at the number of recovery in your place. So number of recovery, if you look at the data of Tamil Nadu, it is around 40% of the total. If you work out You should be getting around 40% of your total infection. This is around, we said, we wanted to suggest that it would be around 25,000 by 96. This is about 18th of June. The 18th of June, the Tamil Nadu should have around 25,000 cases reported. So this is the number which is active cases. Now so therefore by June the 26,000 cases infections should occur. This is what our prediction. This is what I told the Delhi people, that we were able to assess that overestimation by this model and then corrected it for Tamil Nadu and India. That is what we have done. Coming back to this, I think my data was presented to the Chief Secretary by this Principal Secretary. And this is estimation of R0 and R. JB had a very good presentation that this is a baseline reproduction number and R over time. So this is, he has given you the definition of what is R0. Now therefore you see here, this is the serial interval time that we have used gamma distribution, which is not necessary for you. And this tells you that this is, forget about this, we pulled some data to estimate the R0. This is, and therefore, this is a kind of thing which is going on for India. That is, now we have reached that nearly 1 based on this modeling. And this is, if you look at Tamil Nadu, the Tamil Nadu had 2 peaks because of that. One group went for a conference, came back. That is very transparent here. And this is the Coimbatore episode. What is challenging is here that the daily number of cases reported to you should help you to find the R0. So there was a mathematical relationship between the two. Use the modeling to estimate this. So this has, as Jabu said, we have used that incubation period of 4 days with a standard deviation of 2 days. And so therefore, as you see here, now this time point that it suggests there was a peak here, this is for Tamil Nadu, and it takes 4 days for them to get the big number. This is in another way that R0, which is derived from the number of cases you get, reflects what is happening in the community. Another other way of modeling, validating your model. So that is all I have to tell you. Then to study that whether the impact has brought down the new cases, lockdown, there are a lot of newses from the TV channels. Otherwise the epidemic would have gone like this and so on and so forth. And fortunately, India had started the lockdown very early period, therefore we did not have much data to do this exercise. And this is what my comment, JB should not misunderstand me. And this is, what happened was that soon after 14th April, there was a dip. So at that time, there was a significant decline in the number. Then suddenly, that as you see, the Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu started increasing their number. The whole thing got changed. This is time-interrupted regression analysis. This suggested that we introduced many time points that here, lockdown period, and which suggested that absolutely there is no effect on lockdown on this thing. So, but that's why I agree. I appreciate Jabu's work on this. What would have happened if that lockdown has not been introduced, and so on. But with the given data, it looks to me that was introduced, absolutely no effect as seen in the modeling work. This is what we have done. So we have in fact used very simple models. There are, so Jabu started out saying there are many kinds of modeling, probabilistic modeling and so on and so forth, that we used very simple models. We need time to do this work, but we did not have time. This is about the American NASA program to develop a pen. They spent many years and they spent $12 million to get a pen which is working at any gravity. But we used a simple pen like Russians, a pencil like Russians, a very simple model. And what we have done is that that we were able to take the data from other countries, validate the model, and estimate how much of overestimation that model is giving in reality. And therefore, we were able to adjust that kind of overestimation in our data and therefore come to a reasonable number. That is all I have. I thank my juniors who have been working very hard and debugging the R code. Therefore, we were able to understand what is happening. Thank you very much.
I have it. Sorry to pop up again. See, I think the difficult to do modeling because it depends on what interventions are done by the government, by institutions, and by individuals. Everyone changes their behavior to reduce the infection rate. So let me just quote a model by 4 PMM institutions in India: Jawaharlal Nehru Institute, Indian Institute of Science, IIT Bombay, and AFMC Pune. On 23rd March, there was an article in the Indian Express predicting that by May 15th, there will be 5.5 lakh cases and 35,000 deaths in India. That was predicted on March 23rd. So what was the flaw in the assumption? It was not a flaw. They said that assuming that the lockdown finishes on March 3rd. And they said that their model was predicting the Italian and New York data. So that's the problem with modeling, I feel. It doesn't predict what people, institutions, and governments are going to do to try to decrease the spread.
Yeah, see, every day there are 5 modeling work which comes out. That modeling has Johns Hopkins University emblem, Harvard University emblem in their document. I don't know, just for sake of writing, they do this, and whether these universities validate what has been available on the internet and so on. Most of the work which are available on internet is not peer-reviewed papers or articles, so therefore it is very difficult to believe this kind of statistics. So now therefore the last slide which Jebu presented is the validating the model is a very important part. So how do we validate it? You have to see whether it gives a reasonably decent number, which is happening in my state or country. That is very important.
Sir, would you like to address a question of how these models should be used? How do we know it's working? Where should we all stand on modeling?
Because let me do this because I think we are running short of time. Different parts of the world, there is so much inconsistency that we are unable to really come to some conclusion. But to my surprise, what happened was there were estimates of infection to mortality rate. 3 different centers calculated infection to mortality rate, that is probability of death given infection. Impressively, all of them had similar curve, similar pattern. For example, they all concluded that if you are age 80, your probability of dying if you get this infection will be 8%. Not a terrible news because it tells you there's a 92% chance you will walk away. That's okay. Now the problem is when you today go away from this room, I would like to you to carry a mental model of this infection. And for you, the most important and model to remember and in decision making will be related to something that we find consistently coming across, and there is no reason why India should be different. For example, these models suggest under the age of 15, there will be hardly any deaths. Okay, that's number one. Number two, that it suggests, for example, I'll give it for you, a 25-year-old person, if infected, the chance of dying is 30 out of 100,000. These are the kind of figures that we should assimilate so you know how to face the consequence. Doesn't matter how fast it comes, how slow it goes, that is not important. The probability of dying. Now, if you take India as a whole, I think Venkat helped me to translate this infection to mortality in Indian context. And I have some numbers. It is maybe wrong, but on the whole, we are going to compare it so that your own impression of the disease and the risk of dying is clear in your mind. Now, based on this calculation, I use two parameters, that in urban area, the R naught is higher. In the rural area, R naught is lower. Okay, and based on that, we said the infection or the epidemic will come to an end at a particular point in time, just like Jabu has mentioned it again. Now, the picture I want you to take home is this. In India, every year we lose 10 million people. That is 137 crore people and 10 million or 1 crore every year we lose. In that context of that mortality, what will COVID do? And that is the way we should look at it. Now, children, I said, when we calculated hardly any deaths, we will ignore it. That is 36 crore people with that is children below the age of 15. Then there is a 90 crore people in the age group 15 to 59. You know how many we lose every year in this age group? 3 million people. That is the number of deaths. And what will COVID do? COVID will increase it. By how much? Well, it's difficult to say because comorbidities and are confused. COVID's share will be about 2 lakhs into the 3 million deaths in that age group. But the problem starts with the older people. Again, remember comorbidities, anyway they would have died, but COVID's contribution, what will be in the age group above 60? Every year we lose 5 million people in the age group above 60. And remember, this age-specific rate goes up again, just like a COVID rate, with increases with age. COVID will cause 2 million deaths in the context of a 5 million deaths. It cannot be 5 plus 2, but it will be some sort of merger there will be. I want you to take this amount of death and look at it and say, in the higher age group, above 60, is a mess. And that's why I'm sitting here, because my probability of dying is 4 if I came for that meeting. I'm exaggerating, of course. But I think what happens is, if you take away the above 60 population, the remaining part of the disease is not too frightening a disease. That is a mental model I would like you to carry. It makes a lot of difference how you feel. The chance, if you are careful, chance if you are clever, that you will not infect it is there. That is quite high. But given infection, the probability of death in the younger age group is much lower. The epidemic will have to take its course. It will run its course. I mean, you can force it a little, but you saw in Indian context is growing. Maybe Delhi and Mumbai will finish the run of court and we can look back and see what happened there. That is all my comments. Thank you for inviting me.
by state what those numbers are, how many hospital beds you need, and so on. It's just, I mean, like I said before, these models are based on assumptions. We are keeping on updating the assumptions as we have data. Unfortunately, we don't have too much. It's on an Imperial website, Imperial College website. Please have a look at it and play around with it. There are lots of other interesting ones which are available online if you have the time. It's like sliders that you can use to change these parameters and take a look. They're shiny apps. So that's all I had.
Dr. J. Seelan, sir, any comments? Okay. One second.
You said you're hampered by lack of data to put into your models. What is the priority? What are you missing most? What sort of studies really urgently need to be done to inform your models to make them perform better?
So the most useful thing from a modeling perspective is consistent data from SARI patients, proportions that are positive. The other one that would be extremely useful is serological data. If you have a good serology, which is population based in different risk settings, that would tell us what proportion of asymptomatics we are missing. From a modeling perspective, those are, to me, the most important ones.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Yes, I want to thank the delegates, the team here.